The result then which issues from this antithesis consists in the fact that consciousness drops like a discarded cloak its idea of a good that exists only in principle, but has as yet no actual existence. In its conflict, it is learned by experience that the way of the world is not as bad as it looked, for its reality is the reality of the universal. With this lesson in mind, the idea of bringing the good into existence by means of the sacrifice of individuality is abandoned, for individuality is precisely the actualizing of what exists only in principle, and the perversion ceases to be regarded as a perversion of the good, for it is in fact really the conversion of the good as a mere end into an actual existence. The movement of individuality is the reality of the universal. We arrive now at the last few paragraphs of this section on virtue and the way of the world. And when looking at paragraph 391, what we see is the very beginning of the rehabilitation. Well, not the beginning, but an effectuation of the rehabilitation of the way of the world. Hegel will say it's not as bad as it looked. As a matter of fact, it's actually quite good. Virtue has been opposing the way of the world as if the way of the world was bad, but that's not really the case. So what happens here? He says, the result then which issues from this antithesis, this opposition, consists in the fact that consciousness drops like a discarded cloak the idea of a good that exists only in principle. Now notice, he's talked about this cloak before, right? Virtue was caught up in the cloak as a fighter just a few paragraphs earlier and couldn't escape from it. Virtue could not escape from the goodness of at least parts of the way of the world that it was supposed to be combating and changing. Now consciousness is going to drop virtue. It's dropping the idea of a good that exists only in principle, but has as yet no actual existence. Now, does that mean that virtue never could have actual existence? No, but at the time that it's coming out, it's really kind of a promissory note, isn't it? And this is something that is integral to modern discussions of virtue. Even if we put the word virtue aside and we talk about goodness or fairness or justice, because Hegel is talking about something that is supposed to be changing the world for the benefit of humanity, liberating people from unfair, and self-replicating power structures, all these sorts of things that we could talk about, right? If we put aside the word virtue and we substitute more contemporary language, Hegel's saying, well, consciousness, when it realizes what's going on between that and the way of the world, it ends up throwing whatever hasn't been realized away and saying, you're really not any good. You talk about goodness, but this is where I find actual goodness. And again, I mentioned teaching in prison last commentary video. When you're in an environment that is restricted like that, it becomes much more clear that you have to go with realizable goods, goods that you can actually encounter and enjoy and communicate to others, not just some sort of pie-in-the-sky thing that may never really come about. That's how people, if we want to go further with this, that's how people remain unliberated, chained, oppressed, exploited, by reference to these goods that are not actually realized and don't have some sort of, at least what we might call, action plan, a explanation of how they're going to be, if we want to use business terminology, operationalized, right? That's quite important. Hegel goes on, and he says, in its conflict, the conflict between the way of the world and virtue, it is learned by experience This is very important. It can't just, when you're doing the dialectic, you cannot just say, oh, well, Hegel said that this is the case, so let's jump ahead with that. No, sometimes we actually do have to learn by experience. Now, we can learn by our own experience, or we can learn by the experience of others. We don't always have to learn everything firsthand ourselves, but there are many things that require learning by experience. That's what goes on in dialectical phenomenology. So he says, it's learned by experience that the way of the world is not as bad as it looked, for its reality is the reality of the universal. What does that mean? Well, the universal here is actually individuality. Virtue had presented itself as being the universal, hadn't it? But it turns out that virtue isn't the universal. Or at least it's not the whole of the universal. The way of the world encompasses the universal. So he goes on and he says, with this lesson, what we've learned in mind, the idea of bringing the good into existence by means of the sacrifice of individuality is abandoned. See, virtue was supposed to work and overcome the way of the world by sacrificing individuality. The way of the world is that whole body of individualities that are in a bad state because, they follow out their own selfish needs, wishes, inclinations, desires, and thereby make each other miserable as a result, and they tie into power structures and, whatever we want to say, right? So we don't actually have to sacrifice individuality. We don't have to offer it up if we want to, play on the German words, Aufopferung, right? He says, individuality is precisely the actualizing of what exists only in principle. This is really interesting. Notice what he's saying here. It's not just that, okay, it doesn't work to have a pie in the sky, purely ideal, good arrangement for society, some sort of map, right? And then say, okay, well, let's make that real over here. Individuals matter for Hegel. This is not something that I think a lot of people grasp when they're reading Hegel. Individuality does matter. So he says, individuality is precisely the actualizing of what exists only in principle. And now here, there's a little bit of a play on words here that Miller is engaging in that's not actually there in the German. The perversion ceases to be regarded as a perversion of the good, for it is really the conversion of the good as a mere end into an actual existence. I wouldn't rest too much on that per versus con thing, because that's not actually there in the German. It's Verwertung, right? So let's see what he's saying, though. The perversion ceases to be regarded as a perversion of the good. There is a turning that's taking place, right? A pervertere. There is or Verkehrung, right? Something is being turned, something is being changed, but it's no longer being turned away from the good. It's really the conversion or the returning of the good as a mere end into an actual existence. We often think of like the final good in Aristotelian terms as like, that's more important, all that. Aristotle thought the final good isn't just out there as like a lure drawing things. It has to be realized or it's not really a good, right? And Hegel is saying the same thing here in this section. So he says, what do we have here as a result? The movement of individuality is the reality of the universal. Now, how is that the case? We have to look at the next paragraph for that. However, with this result, that which, as the way of the world, stood opposed to the consciousness of what existed only in principle, has in fact likewise been conquered and has vanished. In that antithesis, individuality's being for self was opposed to essence or the universal, and appeared as a reality separated from what exists only in itself or in principle. But since reality has shown itself to be an undivided unity with the universal, then, just as the in itself of virtue is merely an aspect, so does the being for self or the way of the world also prove to be no more than that. The individuality of the way of the world may well imagine that it acts only for itself or in its own interest. It is better than it thinks, for its action is at the same time an implicitly universal action. When it acts in its own interest, it simply does not know what it is doing, and when it avers that everyone acts in his own interest, it is merely asserting that no one knows what action is. When it acts for itself, it simply gives reality to what, to begin with, exists only in itself. The purpose of its being for self, which it imagines, is opposed to what virtue is in itself, its shallow cunning, as also its fine-spun explanations, which know how to demonstrate the presence of self-interest in every action. All these have vanished, just as the purpose of virtue, that exists only in itself, along with its rhetoric, have vanished. At this point, in paragraph 392, what Hegel is trying to do, I mentioned a rehabilitation of the way of the world. That is what he's carrying out, but he wants to show that the universal and individuality wind up being connected with each other, or wind up, in effect, being the way in which the universal is able to have reality. So he says, with this result, that which as the way of the world stood opposed to the consciousness of what existed only in principle, that would be virtue, has in fact likewise been conquered and has vanished. In that antithesis, in the opposition, individuality's being for self, the selfishness, the self-centeredness, if you like, of the way of the world, and the individuals who are encompassed by that. Individuality's being for self was opposed to essence or the universal. What was essence or the universal? At the very beginning, it was virtue. Remember how virtue was so sure of itself that it was something better, something higher, something more powerful than the way of the world. Why? Because it subordinated individuality. So he says, in that antithesis, we had this opposition, and individuality's being for self appeared as a reality separated from what exists only in itself or in principle. And that is virtue. That's why virtue required that self-abnegation, that sacrifice, that offering of one's individuality. The individuality that otherwise would be in the way of the world. And you remember what was caught in the balance were the gifts and talents and capacities and one's own choice, right? What we might call one's will was in between. Now he says, but since reality has shown itself to be in undivided unity with the universal, the universal has the last laugh. The way of the world is that by which it's communicating that last laugh, right? Since reality has shown itself to be in undivided unity with the universal, just as the in itself of virtue is merely an aspect, so does the being for self of the way of the world also prove to be no more than that. What we don't have here is the way of the world simply, encompassing virtue and saying, stupid virtue. You thought you were doing something new. I managed to encompass you within myself. No, both of these are shown to be merely aspects of something greater. And what is that going to be? Individuality. Individuality understood not just as being this individual, but as being part of something. So he goes on and he says, the individuality of the way of the world may well imagine that it acts only for itself or in its own interest. Now remember back to before we even got into pleasure and necessity, the discussion of the ethical substance of a people and how within that ethical substance people act given their own little horizons, their own limited aims. They seem to be in conflict with other people, but it's all part of a larger system, we might call it, a larger system in which their selfish, individual, self-centered, short-sighted motivations turn out to be part of a larger process. As Hegel said before, the individual in working for himself does not just work for himself, he works for the rest of society. If this sounds like Adam Smith, that's along the same sort of lines. Hegel's not postulating an invisible hand or anything like that, but he is saying that within any functioning, organization, society, the action that an individual engages in is not just his or her own action. It becomes thereby the action of the whole and ends up doing more than they intended. So how does Hegel frame this? He says it doesn't know what it's doing. When it avers that everyone acts in his own interest, what is it saying? It doesn't understand what action really is. Sure, people do in fact say to themselves, got to look out for number one, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, screw the rest of them. As a matter of fact, if I have to squash some of them, so be it. But some of what they're doing is not just on their own account, it's spilling over into the rest of the system because no person, is able to really have human action entirely on their own. We saw this in the earlier section of Observing Reason as well, when we talked about all of that. So he says, when it acts for itself, it simply gives reality to what, to begin with, exists only in itself. The purpose of its being for self, which it imagines is opposed to what virtue is in itself, its shallow cunning, as also its fine-spun explanations, which know how to demonstrate the presence of self-interest in every action. If we look at it properly, Hegel says, all of these have vanished. Just as the purpose of virtue that exists only in itself, along with its rhetoric, have vanished. So this is an interesting ending point, isn't it? We're finding that on the one hand, the individuality is connected with the universality, and on the other hand, that both of these turned out to be not the full answer of what is going on, or where the individual should be taking his or her cues from if he or she is to realize what the whole goal of this was, their happiness, their purpose, their meaning, the meaning of their existence. Thus, the activity of individuality, all that it does is in its own self an end. The employment of its powers, the play of those powers in action, is what gives them life. Otherwise, they would be a lifeless in itself. But the in itself is not an unrealized abstract universal that lacks an existence, but rather is itself immediately the present, real existence of the process of individuality. Paragraph 393 is quite short, but there's a lot going on there that is worth dwelling on, particularly given that it is not just a rich section in its own right, but it's also an endpoint. It is the end of this section on virtue and the way of the world. We've already seen that both virtue and the way of the world have turned out to be just moments of something larger than it, which turned out to be the thing that was caught in between the two of them, individuality, right? So we've got that going on. But it's also the end of this entire section of actualization of self-consciousness, this middle part where we, after we finished up with observing reason, we moved to this other practical application of reason, and we start getting into things that we would call the domain of the ethical and start thinking about the nature of society. The things that we're going to see played out a lot more in the sections yet to come, particularly in the spirit section. So what's going on here? Hegel, as usual, is bringing things to a close, but he's already preparing for the section yet to come, and that section yet to come is this fairly short individuality which takes itself to be real in and for itself. So by the end of this section, we should see individuality, at least in principle, at least at the beginning point of grasping itself as real in and for itself. I wouldn't worry so much about the in and for itself. That's going to get worked out later. But the real part is particularly important here because remember, what was the problem with virtue? What was the problem also with the law of the heart? It was that it was not wirklich. And in trying to make it external, in trying to make it real, if we want to take a song title, make it real, not fantasy, right? What had to happen? Well, this is where we learned what virtue, at least modern virtue, turns out to be. This is where we learn what the law of the heart turns out to be, how they pan out. Neither one of them measures up to their own self-talk, what Hegel has called a rhetoric in just a few earlier passages. So let's now take a look at how he's going to bring this section to a close. It says, the activity of individuality, all that it does, is in its own self an end. Now, the translation there is, I'm usually pretty happy with Miller. That's not quite that close, right? So the activity of individuality, the tun, okay, that's action, activity, that's great. All that it does is translating treiben, right? And treiben here it's a verb and it's being used as a substantive, just like tun is, right? As opposed to tat. It's doing, it's driving, right? Treiben is to drive. It's also used for other things as well. But we could think about it as driving itself. There's also an idiomatic expression, tun, here as well. What it does, what it's occupying itself with. It's what it's taking to be the focus and the locus of its action, we could say. And that's okay, so that's okay. Now, what is Hegel saying here? The activity of individuality, all that it does, is in its own self an end. So I've kind of misrepresented this here, right? Individuality is encompassed in the end just as much as in the activity and all that it does. But another way of doing this is we can say, well, look, this is also the end. We've encountered this before, where the activity itself provides its own, we might say, immanent, right? Its own end within its own activity. Not just an end way down the line that we're aiming at, a purpose, an end, a focus, an orientation, a goal. But doing the activity itself is an end. This is what we call, Hegel's not mentioning this at this point, but this is kind of important. Within the Aristotelian tradition, this is what we call praxis, a term that the Marxists are also going to use as well. And Aristotle uses this term as opposed to another term, which is poiesis, making or doing, right? As opposed to the making or doing that culminates in something else, right? Writing stuff here on the chalkboard, I'm not doing that just because I like writing stuff on the chalkboard. I'm doing that for the end of communicating information to you. That's the primary purpose. So what I'm doing is in some respect more poietic than praxis-oriented, although praxis is also a part of it as well. Now, praxis means activities where the end is encompassed within the activity. So, for example, playing chess, you could be playing chess because you want to win a lot of money. Probably not a great way to try to win a lot of money, unless you're really good at chess. You might be playing chess to humiliate your opponent because you want to impress somebody else in the office. I make all these stories up. Or you might be playing it because you actually enjoy and find meaningful, the playing of chess, and then you're going to be playing it in a different way. That's praxis, okay? So Hegel is saying here that individuality is now at the point where it's becoming aware of what's going on with it. Now he says the employment of its powers, the play of these powers in action, is what gives them life. The use or the employment of the powers, the Gebrauch der Kräfte. What are the powers, the Kräfte? They are, the talents, the gifts, all the things that the individual has at his or her disposal within him or herself, which they might develop further as well, right? That could be part of the Gebrauch, the Gebrauchen, how they use those powers. The play, as he says, the play of these powers in action. If we want to be a little bit closer, Spiel der Äußerungen, the play of their externalization, the play of their being made real. That's what action is really about, the actualization of something. He says doing these things with those powers is what gives them life. Powers, you could think about powers, and another word that we use for that in philosophical terms is potentialities, right? But again, potentialities, if they remain mere potentialities, don't really matter. They're not wesentlich. They're not important. They're not essential. They become that by being made actual in a world that we can look at and share and do things in, a world that individuality exists in, but an individuality exists with other individualities in some sort of framework. That's part of what we're going to explore in the next section, also in the spirit massive section of the text, which is just paragraphs away from us, right? Now, all of this, if we don't have this, like he says, otherwise they would be a lifeless in itself. We can talk about, I have this artistic talent, well, did you do anything? Did you draw anything? Did you paint anything? Did you make any music? Did you write anything? No, man, I'm just this artistic talent. Well, no, you're not an artistic talent then. You're just somebody who likes to talk about art and maybe sit around the coffee shop or the bar and talk about the great stuff that you would otherwise be doing, but you're not really doing it. It's lifeless in itself. So he says, but the in itself is not an unrealized abstract universal that lacks an existence. Now, that's if it's actually realized. There's plenty of in itself that are left behind in the dustbin of history, that not even of history go on, right? He says it's the in itself is rather is itself immediately the present real existence of the process of individuality. Individuality, when it actualizes its powers, when it works with them, when it does things, when it engages in praxis, it becomes the universal in a certain respect. Now, that is a nice thing to close on, in part because you're probably saying, well, what the hell does that mean? Well, that's what's going to be worked out, hopefully, not entirely, if I give you a little spoiler, not entirely, but partially in the next section.